Just making sure you guys are awake. Alrighty guys, welcome and thank you. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Richard Gilliland, President, co-founder, Waterbox Aquariums. A lot of people actually know me as the guy that reads the comments on Waterbox Live. So 5 years ago, Waterbox was conceptualized, and 2 years ago, it was born in Beijing. So we've made big strides, and from the very beginning, our core mission statement is to grow the industry through education, conservation, and the sale of aquariums. So that's why you guys are all here today. We've brought in 12 really amazing industry speakers, so stick around, it's gonna be some good stuff. We have Peter Cherrick here with us. He's gonna be our MC for the day, so Reef News Network, I'm gonna hand it off to him.
Thank you very much, Richard. Welcome everybody, welcome to the Keys. How's everybody doing today? On a not so beautiful Keys day, but nonetheless, it's the Keys, so, you know, who cares? So, yeah, first of all, huge thank you to Waterbox, Richard, the whole team, everybody that made this happen. This is an amazing event. This is yeah, big round of applause for these guys, please. This is a first of its kind industry event. Like, you know, this is more reminiscent of going to an educational event with speakers and talkers. You know, you can see we got some stuff around, and we'll get to all the sponsors and everybody, all these giveaways. Make sure you get your tickets in. We're going to be giving stuff away today and tomorrow at the end of the day. What's up, everybody online? Because we do have the Waterbox Live community online, too. We do have a giveaway. These two beautiful tanks here are both going to be given away online. And you go to waterboxaquariums.com/raffle. You can enter to win both of these tanks here. And then you have to be here to win anything that we see around, and we'll get through the sponsors. Out in the hallway, we have stuff going on today. We have the lovely Kelly Quinn doing live painting all day and has her art on display. We have the Coral Restoration Foundation out here today talking about all the wonderful efforts that they've been doing. And then we have a couple school programs too here. Be sure to get out, visit them, see what's going on. In addition, if you have a VIP ticket and you have signed up for an encounter, an aquarium encounter, make sure, if you haven't got it already, that you go and get your ticket. So if you've signed up to do one of the aquarium encounters, be sure you get your ticket from the girls at the front desk where you checked in. So all day long, we're going to be coming to you guys live. We're going to be, everybody's watching online. We got speakers, we got talkers, we got presentations. Super, super busy, full day. More education than you're ever going to get anywhere else in one room. I've been a Waterbox owner for close to 2 years now. It's an amazing product, you know, quality, innovation, all wood stands, all glass overflow. It's stuff like this that has really made me proud to be here and work with these guys and represent these guys, and then also the innovation of doing an event like this. So it's going to be a great day. With that said, we're going to get moving. We're running a little late. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. This man is a legend in the hobby. You know, if there's people here that probably weren't even born when he started in the hobby. He's been a part of this hobby since the 1960s. He's an author, a speaker, you know, conservationist. I could go on and on forever. Inevitably, if you've ever read a book about aquarium keeping or anything, this man's probably had something to do with it. This is Mr. Bob Fenner. Huge round of applause, please. Industry legend right here. Bob, it is all yours, my friend.
Thank you very much. I was a little nonplussed. I guess the show is being broadcast live. The talk, Coral Compatibility. I'd like to thank you all for coming out, making this possible. And of course, our sponsors, the vendors, and Waterbox. I would say if you'd like to see this talk again, or the references from which it was lifted, friends and I have a website, Web Media. People have heard of the internet, that sort of thing, I hope, one way or the other. Oh. Uh-oh. Is that going to work? So, first of all, I have a question. I guess, well, some of the people here are not old, middle-aged friends from the trade, but most people are in the industry. Are there any, some hobbyists? Oh, there we go. Reef people. Mainly reef people, fish only, reef, right? You know the similarity between the word reef and grief? And for you folks who are unmarried, finance and fiancé, that sort of thing? Well, you will know. Well, when I was a kid, the TV shows and high school life science classes would talk about the symmetry, beauty, and balance of the world's oceans. And so it's kind of threw me. And so my question to you, as hobbyists and people in the industry, do you see the world's reefs as some sort of pastoral existence? Something like Walt Disney's Bambi, existing in the world's shallow tropical waters? Well, in actuality, the world's reefs are much more like Bambi versus Godzilla. There's just an ongoing battle, red tooth and claw, for space, food, light, current, and mates, or just reproduction, period. And so I would ask you, if you get a chance, or are many people here divers, scuba, snorkel, in addition to Aquarius? Double in happiness. There we go. When you're out swimming along the reef, you probably notice that the life there is not randomly distributed. You look down and there's some sort of rhyme or reason. Some organisms are more predominant. Some have better space. They're on the top of bommies, what have you. And other ones are kind of hiding in the shadows, not so common, what have you. And yes, I did a stint as a high school teacher, so I have to quickly mention some of the background a bit, just in case people go, the coral compatibility, and what is this word, Cnidarians? The old phylum name, Selenorata, I like better, but basically to tell people the sciences are a little different than the industry and hobby, and the sciences only soft corals and stony corals are true corals, whereas in the hobby and trade, we call many of the stinging cell member groups corals, whatever corals are, including things even like the hydrozoans, like fire coral, and stylasterines like this Distichopora. And real quick, these are polyp-like life. They have certain features in common. They have tentacles for examining their world and hurting the neighbors. They have a single body cavity called the selenoron. It's kind of gross this early in the morning, but they take food in and throw waste out of the same opening. And they have 3 germ layers, as opposed to things like sponges that only have 2. Some examples of Cnidarians from the top left: stony corals, soft corals, polyps, mat polyps, gorgonians, sea fans, zoanthids, even anemones, some people call corals. The antipatharians, called also anemones, and mushrooms. So you go out in the world's reefs and take a look around, and where there's hard substrate, where do you find a lot of stinging cell life? Sometimes up to 85% of the substrate is covered by what we call corals. And those things, as you might guess, like if the floor here were covered with pizza and beer, there'd be plenty of folks trying to make inroads to consume them. So there are many predators and even parasites of stinging cell life in the wild. And so the organisms there, they have mechanisms, as you might guess, to ward off being eaten or being displaced. And for us, as people in the industry and hobbyists, these have very important implications. So there's a few ways to go about classifying how stinging cell life interacts with each other to establish dominance. And I break them down into 3 categories. There are means by way of growing, physical means, and then chemical allelopathy. And allelopathy means, allela means other, and pathos means disease or harm. So it's ways of poisoning your neighbor. In the way of growing means, the 3 principal hermatypic families of corals, the porridids, acroporids, and bacilloporids, they're the winners, creating reefs on the basis mainly of they're being able to overgrow their neighbors. They grow quickly and shadow them out. Another way is by actually butting up against your neighbor. And very often you see this, the demilitarized zone, this gap between coral colonies. And in particular, as stated, this involves mainly stoloniferans and sea fans, but almost all families of cnidarians have this means of competing with each other. Simply blocking your neighbor can be useful. Again, not just the light, but the current itself. And it's not, and just in case you're on the Alex Trebek show and they ask, are there corals that actually move around that are modal? You folks all probably know most of the fungiids, the mushroom corals, can actually move about. And it may seem very slow, but one of the benefits they accrue from doing this is they actually can block out other organisms. And then here we go. Let's say you don't like your neighbor. Maybe you're like Jeffrey Dahmer. So what are you going to do? You eat them. Digestive dominance. This examples I use are a couple of species of sea anemones we have off the west coast of the U.S. The one on the bottom is called the clone anemone, Anthopleural gigantissima. But once again, those two colonies, if you can see them, there's a break in between the two of them. The ones on the top and bottom are genetically identical with their own group, but differ between the two. And if they ever get close enough to each other, they try to eat each other. And if that wasn't enough trouble, let's say they're in your aquarium, the pellets that they throw up after eating, those can likewise get out and dissolve their neighbor. Is everybody ready to give up their aquarium and turn it into a guinea pig raceway? I hope not. And there's a bunch of ways to describe or define the sticky, the agglutinant or stinging structures, either cells or inclusions that we call cnidocyst or nematocyst. And these you can do a demo just cutting off like a little piece of a tentacle on any of these anthozoan cnidarians, put it underneath a glass cover slip with a drop of water and tapping it with like a pencil. And you'll see that physically you can make these things turn inside out and stick into something if it was there, or you can add some chemicals and it'll do the same. So used for both those purposes, both for attaching to things and to stinging them to get them to move away. A bit further away in terms of warding off one's neighbor are a group of cnidocysts called holotrix and mastigophores. And most common, these are amongst cold water sea anemones, but there are soft and hard corals that likewise use these. And here's one most everybody's probably familiar with. How many people here have not or have had troubles with sweeper tentacles, sweeping out and touching someone, their neighbor? Real big problem. And in particular, the stony corals, and in particular the one family, the galaxias, the oculinids, these things are the winners. They can reach out about a foot and sting their neighbors. So if you're going to, especially if you're going to fragment them one way or the other, you need to have a real good distance between the individual frags. And to tell you, just like if people can remember from, high school chemistry, physics, the reduction oxidation potential, you can make a classification scheme of more likely to sting and the one that's going to be the winner or loser between groups of these organisms. I just mentioned the galaxias. They're kind of near the top, like fluorine, let's say. They'll take an electron from anybody. But here are some general statements. Gonioporas, likewise, flowerpot corals are very stinging. Lobophilias are kind of in the middle. And then things like Montiparas are much more easygoing. Then the last category, and a very big one, and unfortunately something that's not easy to measure and sometimes not easy to prevent, and that are chemical means of restricting your neighbors. Where is this especially a problem? When you buy or receive new livestock. One of the reasons that you hear me harp over and over again about isolating or quarantining new specimens. Give them a chance, for one, to rest up, but for two, chemically to not release so much material that it malaffects the other organisms in your system. And I do mean your other organisms, including fishes and even macroalgae. And what can you do about it? We'll touch on this the last part of the program. I'm a giant fan of ozone. Most all the large culture companies in the world, commercial and individual, as well as all public aquariums, utilize ozone O3 to reuse and keep consistent redox potential. That's very useful. And some of these compounds can be removed to a degree via activated carbon use. And what organisms are involved here? To me, it's amazing. Sometimes I've been around the world in the Philippines, Malaysia, where they have very large beds of soft corals, where the dive boat, collecting boat is going over the reef, and you can actually smell some of these chemicals from the water. They're that common. And I've, of course, smelled them when we receive organisms in the wild that have been collected, and even in hobbyist aquariums that are having troubles. So chemical allelopathy is very, very common, and as stated, it's highly variable. The individual colony, the state of health of the specimen, and even the conditions in the water can determine how toxic the situation may be. And what are they used for? Again, this is naturally occurring materials. They're used to secure space, resources one way or the other, and even to avoid parasites. And just in case there's some organic chemists in the audience, I have a couple of cells about what these compounds are. The suffix oid means like or kind, so they're sort of like terpenes. And terpenes are actually very, very common. They're predominant organic molecules. And some favorite examples, there's some aromatics, including, of course, cannabinoids. I don't know how legal they are in Florida, but the lipids, the fats, very useful in human biology, are also terpenes. And now the second half of the talk, what you actually can do to prevent these sorts of problems. I should actually ask, because this is getting on in years since people were involved in heavily in the reef aquarium part of the trade. How many people think they've themselves personally experienced problems with interaction of stinging cell life in a reef system? Is there anybody who thinks they have not experienced a problem? It is actually very, very common. So I'll tell you what I'm going to say, and then I'll tell you some examples of what it is. So prevention is key. The real problem can be solved by just avoiding it. And these ways, well, I'll go into further detail. And then let's say you blew it already and the organisms are malaffecting each other. There actually are treatments for the effects. First off, how can you tell that something is going wrong in your system? Mainly by what? Careful observation. I'm a giant fan of saying more biology, less technology. But even if you rely on technology, you should become a careful observer of your system. The organisms themselves will show signs. And for stinging cell life itself, of course, you look at the polyps. They're not opening. In this case, the one's dissolving. It's pretty obvious it's in trouble. Sometimes you start seeing the skeletal septa showing through. And if the thing's a long, low-time, low-grade poisoning, you see those organisms not growing or growing away from their neighbors. And oh joy, as I mentioned, it's not just the stinging cell life. The other life in the system may well be mal-affected as well. And for fishes, typically you see them having private parties in the corner, become ataxic in their behavior, kind of swimming around like they're having private parties, and either very rapid or very slowed respiration, not many gill movements. And then of course, yes, our favorite, death. And of all things, even algae kind of makes sense. The stinging cell life's been around about 600 million years. Some of the algae have been around supposedly from the Cambrian a long time, but they've put up with each other and competed with each other for hundreds of millions of years. And even the algae can be mal-affected by the stinging cell life in a system. In this case, it's some halimeda that's blanching out, showing that it's made of calcium carbonate. For the people in the trade, on the collection side, one of the things you can do is right from the get-go, after you've wild collected or received specimens in from the wild or even culture, is to try to keep the water very fresh amongst them and to change the water frequently and not allow the organisms physically to come in contact with each other. Because the people are in the audience, I'll even make a real quick mention. A real common technique that is used on either collection again or transporting of these animals is we'll lower the specific gravity, let's say on a receiving table, by just throwing in a bucket, a container of fresh water to reduce the density a thousandth or two, and then adding a huge amount, we don't even measure it, of iodide, potassium iodide. And part of the reason we lower the specific gravity is the organisms will take the iodide in much more readily. But it is actually that useful. And again, as hobbyists or people in the industry, if you have a new system, what do you want to place first? The less stinging specimens and species. A plug for my favorite device for receiving and acclimating new specimens, kitty litter trays here on the bottom, polyethylene, chemically inert. They can be stacked one way or the other. Again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but a very good idea to utilize a quarantine system. It can be very simple, something with a heater. I like covers of some sort. Even photosynthetic organisms, they don't necessarily need to be illuminated for a week or even days or a week. In the wild, sometimes there's not much sun for a very long period of time. And a simple filter, like a sponge filter, they can leave running in your main display system. And here it is. This is the most important cell of the whole talk. This is the take-home lesson. So I want to make sure and emphasize it. What's the most important thing a person can do to avoid these sorts of troubles? After isolating new specimens, to introduce them to each other on a slow basis. And what I mean is to put them in your isolation quarantine system someplace else for a week or two to assure they're healthy, that they don't have much in the way of parasites, pests, even pollution coming in with the water they've been shipped in. And then, like Boris Karloff, Marty maybe knows who Boris Karloff was, but like Boris Karloff, the famous actor, take a liter, a cup of water, and move it from the quarantine system, pour it into the main tank, and vice versa. Take the water from the main display tank and put it in the quarantine tank. You may not think this does a whole lot, but the organisms can tell the presence of each other on the basis of just a few molecules. So it goes a huge way of introducing the players without allowing them to get to each other. So doing that a few days, just a cup a day, back and forth, really would save many, many organisms, and actually many, many hobbyists not leaving the interest. So this is an aquarium up above Bob James. He and his wife started Macna 31, 32 years ago. And so the first and fourth Macna was in Ontario. They have this tank. It's 350 gallons. You can see it's pretty chock-a-block full. And I don't know if you can make out, there's actually a couple of carpet anemones in there, but generally don't get along with much else. Some giant clams, one way or the other. It's just an example of two things. For one, how big should your bank account be, displacement in your Harley, what have you. The bigger the better, right? And for your aquarium, I just assume silicone in the glass in the door and fill the house up. But the long and short of it is, it's a good idea to have a big system. And what? Do good things happen quickly in reef systems? Generally not. So better to buy small specimens and have them placed distal to each other and have time go by and have them grow up. And if they do, even organisms that in the wild would rarely tolerate each other's presence learn to grow together. So bigger is better, and small specimens grown over a long period of time. Whatever you use, if it's your iPhone, laptop, what have you, a piece of paper, a good idea to detail your stocking plan and look into the likelihood those organisms will get along together. And again, to stock the less obnoxious ones first, then work your way up the scale as time goes by. Yeah, and a plug for captive produced specimens. By and large, these are far, far easier going. Much more likelihood to live under captive circumstances and to get along with each other versus wild collected. Just to reiterate, a good idea to have a distance between the things, if you can, a whole foot, even if they're not galaxias, and allow them just to grow up and get used to each other over time. Here's this term, always throws me like jumbo shrimp or military intelligence, what have you, but the idea of dynamic equilibrium, dynamic, meaning to change and equilibrium to stay the same. But the folks who are adherents of this idea, they very often periodically disrupt their systems. In an ideal world, you'd have something like the Monaco Aquarium where you're running new water, whatever new water is, into your system all the time and overflowing the dirtier, heavier water out to waste. But making frequent partial water changes, I'm still a giant fan of that, usually weekly, one way or the other, is a very, very good step. No matter what else is going on in your system, chemically, physically, biologically, a good idea to keep the system in dynamic equilibrium. Again, real common sense and a real common issue. We get people writing into web media every week where their specimens have fallen from where they placed them on their wall of rock or bommies, one way or the other onto other ones. That's a disaster. So the same old techniques of making sure whatever hard decor you're using are set down on the bottom of your system, maybe the gravel, whatever substrate moved around it, and anything stacked on top secured to where itself will not fall, and then the specimens themselves secured to that. And I know some people buy a rock that's already cut flat, but if you don't have that, again, most rock is pretty easy to drill and tie together, or you can adhere it with epoxies, what have you. I don't know, there are some people that claim there are stinging cell life that are photosynthetic. There are species and groups that are not photosynthetic, but even the photosynthetic ones need to be fed. This is one of my common pet peeves, and also the issue about cleanliness not being sterility. All these systems need some measurable amount of soluble phosphate, nitrate, what have you. And it kind of cracks me up. I've been to places in the world that do aquaculture on the land versus in the water, intensive versus extensive. And what do we do there? We actually add chemical feeds to the water for things like ammonia, one way or the other, just to make sure it's not rate limiting. So being around people who go, I've got 0.0 phosphate and what have you, that really doesn't work. And a plug for using timers for lighting, though there may not be during cyclones, what have you, much light getting to the reefs, pretty much the light goes on and goes off every day, year in, year out. The timers are the best way to do that. In circulation, I know Jake Adams was going to be here one way or the other. The circulation is actually very important as well. And again, the terms, you don't want it to be laminar. You don't want it to be blasting directly on your organisms. It can reciprocate. It can be faster or slower, but it should be vigorous and non-laminar. And I'm still a fan of skimming. Are there any people in the room that don't use skimmers at all? None. There we go. So skimming, again, just like frequent partial water changes, a very good idea, inexpensive, relatively efficient in terms of maintaining water quality. And old friend Anthony Calfo and I, we tried to trick people a few decades back into being more successful by promoting the use of refugiums, live sumps, one way or the other. I still am a huge fan of refugiums, especially ones that are set up with deep sand beds, reverse daylight photoperiods, to where when the light is going off on the main display system, it goes on the refugium. There are many folks that use refugiums, sure. And RDP, and then finally, again, like I say, unfortunately, the system or situation where there's already been trouble, your organisms are stressed, maybe dying. The very best thing you can do is try to determine who the winner is and move them. If you can't do that, making a very large water change, dilution may help, and of course cleaning your skimmer and using chemical filtrants. And unfortunately, it's not just stinging celled life that are trouble. There's a whole host of other organisms, in particular evil blue-green algae. Can we hear a hiss from the group here? That's right. BGA is real trouble in terms of poisoning systems. But the reality is that almost all organisms have some sort of mechanisms for avoiding predation or securing resources. And sometimes you can't tell where all the BGA is. For instance, there are some nudibranchs, like this one here, a solar-powered nudibranch, that have blue-green algae actually living inside them. And the pitch again for dynamic equilibrium. Changing it and keeping it the same. So real quick review. The reality is that sometimes extreme competition is real trouble in captive systems. And it just mirrors what happens in the wild. There are a bunch of ways that you can prevent it. I've gone over and over them. Bigger is better. Picking out healthy specimens. Quarantining them for a bit. Starting with a less occupied system and letting organisms grow into each other. And then the biblio. If you'd like to see this, you probably can't read it here. Again, it's on Wet Web Media. And then, again, a big thank you to you and to Waterbox for having me out. And questions, suggestions?
If anybody has any questions, just raise your hand. I'll come out to you.
Thanks, Peter.
Questions? Come on. You guys are in presence of a legend. Take this opportunity. Ask the man something.
I didn't have my pointer. I couldn't reach it.
Oh, all right. We got a couple over here. Yes, sir.
So when you talk about moving the cup of water between the quarantine tank and your main tank, I'm assuming that is after you've made sure the corals don't have anything before you...
Indeed.
Okay.
Curtis asked, how long? Usually a week or two. You know, the universe is not a zero-sum game, and so the issue is, like, if you wait forever, will you not have crypt problems? You know, will your organisms be happy? No, there's, you know, a minimum, a likely minimum, and the point of diminishing returns is right around 2-3 weeks. At that point, the organisms that are isolated suffer more for that isolation than not. But like I say, many, many problems. When people started in the giant clam business, the troubles with pyramidellid snails, folks would just stick the clams all in together with each other. And when cultured clams came, people were still doing that, and they didn't realize that the snail problem could be avoided by simply isolating and examining the byssal area of the clam. So to say it, the new organism should go in a separate system. Yeah, and maybe be mounted on a piece of PVC or something to where you can get around and look. And by a week or two, you'll know if there's, you know, copepods, bristleworms, what have you, that you don't really want. And at that point, then start trading the water back and forth.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else?
Don't be shy.
Once? Oh, okay, here we go. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could speak more about the mud in a refugium.
Oh, well, actually, I'm trying to write a piece on the same topic right now, just by coincidence, for the TFH magazine. And I'm an old friend with Lang C, who started the unfortunate adverb miracle mud. And for folks who've really been around a long while and had freshwater systems, the old Leiden method from the Netherlands of applying soil laterites to substrates as an adjunct to nutrifying life. It turns out that the gunk, the muck, the silt, sediment, what have you, in substrates is very important. And so how important? It provides some mineral base, but also some of the molecules are known to act as a biological catalyst. They speed up rates of reactions of necessary chemical changes that are and are sometimes not consumed in the process. So again, my plug in just general terms is to not be over fastidious about cleaning your system. If you have, especially a big system, to only vacuum a third or half of it per whatever interval of maintenance, and to leave the mulm on this nasty material there. And I am a giant fan again of using mud, and there around the world there's a few dozen. Walt Smith has Fiji mud, for instance, Walt Smith International, and the folks at Seachem, they have a very nice soil product. But there are many of them, and they have their use. If you don't want them because you don't like the looks, you can put them just in your refugium, as you state, and they'll do all the good pretty much you're going to get if you have just even a few gallons a minute of circulation back and forth. But they are very, very useful. And if you really don't like them, but you want some of the benefits. Let's say you're growing mangroves, what have you, just the same as culture of freshwater aquarium plants. You can blind pot the mangrove in with rocky substrate, sand, what have you, with the mud sequestered underneath it. But very, very useful. And again, around the world where people are having troubles, especially anomalous issues, and they can't determine what the real root cause is, sometimes adding just a little mud to the system magically changes the situation. And for the people who are scuba divers, a lot of folks have nowadays been to muck diving one way or the other, but the muck areas are incredibly productive. There's so much life there, it just absolutely amazes me. My favorite example is actually the Manna Dive at Keahole on the Big Island. You go there, and I ask the people after they've experienced it, that some days there's not many mannas, some days there are literally tons of animals. They're coming there almost every day, feeding on life that's come out of the substrate. And mainly they're polychaete worms, you know, again. But I ask you, I go, how much productivity must there be just in the substrate around where they throw those lights to bring up the plankton, what have you, to where it feeds thousands of pounds of animals? Again, that is possible not from, you know, aragonitic, oolithic sand, but that the mud sediment that's in and amongst that sand. So anyway, I'm a giant fan of mud use.
Is there any issue with adding it to an already established tank?
The main issue is actually aesthetic rather than functional. You know, a lot of people don't like the looks or even just the idea of having mud in their system. I, again, am a giant fan of having isolated components to where you go, well, now I really want to replenish, because the mud actually gets used up, the organic portion, the same as terrestrial gardening. About half of it goes away every year. And so you want to be adding some, the same as live rock, you know, putting some back, changing some out. So if you had an external sump, it's just easy, you know, to turn the pump off, turn the valves off, and scoot the gravel aside, and actually add either the mix with your new substrate, because the substrate gets used up as well. You know, you see over time it dissolves. Our systems are reductive, they're acidic over time. But having the mud and sand, the new one mixed, and being able to place it, especially underneath something, to where it keeps it from going into suspension, I think is very, very useful. That's a great question. I'll tell you, I wish I knew some of the answer. A friend, Scott Fillman, asked me just yesterday, like, do you know of a scientific paper that people have gone out and taken a sample in the wild? I go, you know, I don't right offhand, but I'd be very interested. Most everybody I've known in the trade that sells those muds hasn't really analyzed them. They just know that, you know, just like operationally, like pushing down on a lever in your car, that it makes the vehicle accelerate, that the things work. I'm generally not real satisfied with that. I'd like to know why. But I do know that they do function in that way. And the temporary discoloration of the water, that can be dealt with pretty easily. But they're not the real issues like of mortality or morbidity from adding muds, not the muds that are made commercially.
Great question. Anybody else? Oh, over here. Yes, sir.
Hey there, how you doing? I was wondering if you could touch on blue-green algae a little bit. You said you may or may not know that it's even there, but
Yeah.
what would be some of the indicators, and how would you manage that?
That's a great question. And again, you know, people go, here it is. I've seen God as a polychaete. You know, they're so common and such big winners in the world of invertebrates. But blue-green algae, they're even the bigger winners. There are places in the world where they get going in animal water troughs and kill like sheep and cows one way or the other. And how can you tell like if they're there? Well, even in like a dear friend of Scott Michael, he lives in Nebraska, and they have issues with marine blue-green algae and brand new systems. Where did the spores from the algae come from? They came from the air. So like trying to avoid them entirely, that's not going to happen. What you want to do, of course, is make the circumstances propitious for the organisms you want to grow. But given the fact that there's warmth, light, nutrient, you're going to have some sort of algal proliferation. And it's better to have, the groups of ones that are less noxious or even more useful. But the blue-green, there are some blue-greens that are not real trouble, but most of them you do want to avoid. They come in all different colors, red, green, blue, what have you, black. The only commonality is that they're real slimy. People have a microscope. You can look, they're actually monarins. They're not even protists. So they don't have a nucleus. And just like bacteria, they only have one strand of DNA. Anyway, the long and short of it is you want to make the system either by adding maybe even macroalgae, larger algae, varieties that you want to grow, and then favoring the circumstances, having high and steady redox, not too much soluble phosphate. You want some, but not too much, what have you. And otherwise, like I say, the only way to really tell what the thing is to sample it. And you don't have to have a very expensive microscope. You can buy one of those Mattel, Intel, 200, 400 power scopes, and you'll be able to tell what the blue-green is. Very, very different from the true algae, the thallophytes.
Would UV sterilizers be effective against that sort of?
UV really does help. In fact, when I was a kid and UVs first started being sold for the marine aquarium interest in the late 60s, early 70s, the principal use of UV in aquarium use was to produce ozone. And so the little larger for ozonizer systems, they use corona discharge, electrical means of making O3, but really the principal use, everybody goes, I'm going to zap, bacteria, the total bacteria count, keep it lower. I'm going to maybe even kill parasites, which are really relatively huge. In order to kill parasites with UV, you have to have a lot of UV or a very long dwell time, like not much water going through it. And so, but they are useful indirectly for keeping BGA down, blue-green algae, by raising the redox, the ORP of the water. Very, very useful. And again, if people have fish stores or aquaculture holding systems that are very large, I cannot encourage you enough to look into ozonizers. People would go, what's the first thing I should buy? I only have whatever, a few $100s. Should I buy a UV sterilizer? Should I buy, a contactor for filtrants? Should I buy whatever? The first thing you probably should buy is some source of ozone generation. And the next thing to buy is actually a dryer to go with your ozone producing piece of equipment. It's that useful and that important.
Good. Thank you very much.
Hopefully I'm not shouting.
All right, folks, we've got time for one more. Oh, Mr. Hammertree.
Thank you, Bob, for the
Hey,
great
David.
talk. I'm going to stump you, okay? I got a question for you.
I'm ready.
Everybody in here is wondering it. Where can we get 4 AquaFX for $35? That's all I can think about right now.
Here we go. That's it. When I heard the introduction by Peter, I'm like, yeah, he's a legend. I'm like, old. That's it, old.
No, thank you for the great talk.
Yeah, that's the when the dollar was a dollar. That's that sort of thing. So, but again, I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with all of you. Don't be strangers. You can write us on Web Media anytime.
Guys, huge round of applause, please. Thank you very much to Bob. wetwebmedia.com. Be sure to check it out. Check Bob out. If you ever have an opportunity to see him again at one of these shows, be sure to always catch his talks. Snappiest dresser in the industry. If you're coming to the margarita party tonight, take your cues here for what to wear. All right, guys, coming up, you got a few minutes here before we get into our next talk, which will be Roxanne from the Coral Restoration Foundation. There is water and coffee right out here in the hallway. Take a step out, get a quick